In 1995, a young British Army recruit, Private Cheryl James, was found dead at her guard post in a military training camp, Deepcut Army Barracks in the south of England. The authorities immediately told her devastated parents that Cheryl had committed suicide. But as more evidence came to light, this claim began to look very doubtful. Other information hinted at murder. 3 other young recruits died at Deepcut too. Each time, the suggestion was the same: suicide. Despite a campaign by parents and members of Parliament spanning over a decade, they still don't know what really happened. But they did reveal a culture of bullying and abuse in the British Army. Instead of being proactive, the government chose to distance itself from the revelations. What are the authorities hiding? How successful have they been at keeping the deaths, and even Deepcut Barracks itself, away from public attention? And what message does this send? We put these simple questions to the British public. We began by seeing if the public had heard of Deepcut Barracks, and if so, why. Have you ever heard of a place called Deepcut Army Barracks?
Have I heard of the place? No. No. I haven't.
Yes. In south of Dorking, I believe, somewhere down that way. Not a good reputation in the past for looking after some of the young soldiers, but other than that, that's it.
Have you ever heard of Deepcut Army Barracks?
No. I have heard of Deepcut Army Barracks, but I'm not quite sure why, to be honest.
Well, it's a military base, and there was some years ago now, but I think there was some bullying going on.
Clearly, public awareness of Deepcut was patchy. Why is Deepcut so low profile, given the incidents that occurred there? We asked our experts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been quite a lot of publicity over the years about what has happened to army recruits at Deepcut Barracks. People will be aware, I think, that there are a series of accusations of abuse, and indeed accusations that some of the recruits have in fact died under the care, supposedly, of the commanding officers at Deepcut Barracks. And I think it's a deeply disturbing story that needs to be investigated much more fully and brought to the attention of the public much more fully than it has been so far.
There's been a series of deaths over a period of 10 years, most of them unexplained, with no clear understanding of what happened. Various inquiries have gone into it. The military police, the Metropolitan Police, and I think the Surrey Police all tried to find a conclusion, some of them saying unexpected deaths, suicides, or another inquiry which was semi-official, which put it down to other things.
Parliamentary documents confirmed bullying and abuse of young recruits had occurred in the British Army, including at Deepcut. So, how do the public view this information? Have you ever heard that there has been a government report showing there's been bullying and abuse in the British Army? And if you did hear that, and there is a report to suggest it, what would be your view of that?
I've heard of reports. I don't know if that's a government report. I guess with a community of people, things like that are inevitable to a certain point, but I mean, it doesn't make it any better.
I mean, I guess without knowing the facts, it's always quite hard to say. I'm sure there is an element of bullying in the military, as there are in most institutions. I mean, it's quite hard to say without the facts, I guess.
I'd say personally, I can imagine, I've never been in the army, so it'd just be speculating, but playing sports and stuff, there is that kind of reputation, sort of, it happens where there is a collective already, so if you're a new recruit, perhaps you have to be initiated in. This kind of thing happens, and once you get over that line, you then feel a bit of resentment to the people that are coming in because you've had to go through it yourself.
Have you heard the bullying and abuse that's taking place in the British Army against new recruits? What would be your view about that?
It would obviously be disturbing. I don't think it would be very good for the general morale of the army, and that can't be good for any of us.
Well, I don't think any bullying is necessary at all. I understand that in the army you're probably having to put people into very difficult conditions and you're trying to test their ability to react to conditions, so maybe people can misconstrue that
responsibility that they have and exercise that right in a different way. And maybe that manifests itself in bullying, but I don't think anybody has the right to bully someone.
Clearly, bullying is unacceptable to the public. How widespread is it in the British Army? Again, we turn to our experts.
I think this is how armies work. You've got to take people who've actually got no propensity whatsoever to want to be involved in the kind of discipline that armed forces involved, and they've got no interest and no natural propensity to go to other parts of the world and kill people. So you have to dehumanise them, you have to brutalise them, you have to break their independence of spirit, you have to make them people who will obey orders and ultimately obey the order to go and kill another human being. And so brutalisation is part of what training in the armed forces is about.
Well, systematically, being in the army is about breaking down your personality and making you into a soldier. And as we're all individuals, and for them to create you as a soldier, they have to break your personality down. And part of the tool the British Army uses is bullying, it's harassment, it's cajoling, it's, you know, a kick up the backside to get you up that wall that you have to climb over, or alternatively, it's a lot of other techniques which have all come out in these inquiries and information of harassment, bullying, and sad things such as that.
We move to a darker question. When those 4 recruits did die at Deepcut, the army suggested that each was suicide. But many claimed murder. Despite calls for answers, the government stubbornly refuses a public inquiry. We asked the public what should happen.
4 young recruits were actually found dead at Deepcut Army Barracks. A lot of people think that was part of the culture of bullying which led to murder. And despite that, there's no one doubts, no one denies they were found dead there, despite that the government refuses to do an independent public inquiry to establish the facts, even though the parents have been asking for it for over 10 years. What do you think should happen?
Well, it needs to be an independent inquiry about it, and somebody needs to be brought to justice and accountable for. And if people have gone missing and the parents know that their kids have gone missing or whatever, something needs to go on to, you know, justify it, really.
I think it's entirely wrong. I think they should have an inquiry. If someone's died, and if it was one of my family members, I'd want a full inquiry. So I think they should get a full inquiry, to be quite honest.
Well, that's not bullying. That's murder. That's a criminal offence, isn't it? So there should be at least some kind of police inquiry into that, or some kind of independent duty. I mean, you can't self-police a murder. That's awful. Well, that needs to be checked out.
4 young recruits were actually found dead at Deepcut Army Barracks, and many people, including the parents, think they were murdered, but the government refuses to hold a public inquiry to find out what actually happened, even though the parents have been asking for that for 10 years. Do you have a view about that?
I think it sounds like a public inquest would be a very reasonable thing for them to ask for, yeah.
Well, I think the government runs its own game, whichever government's in. I mean, for instance, there's a certain Mr. Kelly who died very suspiciously, and there's been no actual coroner's report open in court about that, so it doesn't surprise me that our government and agencies act in ways that we are not party to.
With the public backing an inquiry, why is government so opposed? We asked our experts.
I think it's shocking. I think if anybody comes to harm, especially if they lose their life, but even if the harm is less than that, when they're in the care of a state institution like the British Army, the very least that their friends and relatives can expect is that the conditions and the circumstances of their death will be properly investigated, and that should be done publicly and openly. There's too much that's behind closed doors here that the Army can't expect to be a law unto itself. If this happened in any other institution, there would be such an open inquiry, and there should be in this case.
The vested interest for the MOD is always to keep quiet about these type of events. It's always got a culture and always has a culture, from my experience of having served in the armed forces and from the experience of fellow colleagues in military families against the war, is they, any way that they can hinder the truth coming out, any way that they can stop the truth coming out, any way that they can make even a slight glimpse of the truth coming out be beneficial to them, they will do it. And I think it's a culture of lies the MOD has.
there is an even darker element to the Deepcut story. A former instructor, Leslie Skinner, had been moved to Deepcut after being court-martialed for indecent exposure while serving in the army in Northern Ireland. At Deepcut, his criminal abuse continued, and he was sentenced to a lengthy jail term after being found guilty of more assaults there. How do the public regard the Army's decision to move a man into a position of authority over young recruits after being court-martialed relating to a sex act?
He should definitely have got fired and prosecuted as well. Definitely. It's not acceptable.
But obviously emulating the Catholic Church and various other places where they look after their own, including the medical profession. Yeah.
If he was proven guilty of a crime, I don't think that would be reasonable in any walk of life, in the army or in civilian life.
I wouldn't want to say I expect that, but the fact it's happened, if it has, is disgusting. Lock him up.
If it had been objectively proven by a fair board of people, so maybe the police really, objective board, then yes, that's awful. That should be shut down. That person should at least be tried in a public court, and the police should get involved in that if it can be publicly proven.
No. Just no. That's disgusting. Yeah, it's horrible. I don't think that should be on, especially not to work in the army again.
Why did the Army give someone with a history of sexual offending the power over young recruits? We asked our experts.
It's not what we expect from any institution. Any institution in this society where an individual behaved in these ways, we would expect disciplinary action to be taken against them, and we would expect them not to be able to continue in their post. This is an absolutely basic and elementary right.
There's no doubt that the British Armed Forces has a warped form of understanding of what is justice. You can see so many times in history. For example, in Iraq, there was a senior officer that was involved in the torturing process there, and he got promotion and went up the ladder of the army. The army does not punish people that do wrong for it. It actually benefits them. They go up the ladder of career advancement.
As a result of these revelations, changes were made to how young recruits are supposed to be treated. But we know from reports that bullying continues. What should be done, or even can be done, about it?
Changes have now been made because the government did actually concede that there was a case to answer, which is meant to reduce bullying, but the bullying has manifestly continued according to reports from within the army itself. What's your view about what should or maybe could be done about that?
Well, it sounds like there might be a systemic problem with the army, and that's definitely something that should be looked into further. It sounds like that what they've done so far is not enough, they need to improve whatever measures they put in place.
Obviously, it should be treated as a crime, and we should look into all these issues very, very carefully. However, I have to say, if you go back to the British Army of 100 years ago, they shot people who transgressed and didn't want to fight. I don't see that whole culture changing even today. And we've still got bullying, we've still got... If you join the military, you're ending up, and I think, in a toughening process. I think part of that process gets out of hand, but where do you draw the line? The thing is, don't fight, don't join the army, and let's have a peaceful world.
So we know that culture of bullying has actually continued. What do you think should or even could happen to stop that?
Well, changes need to be made. Somebody needs to bring the government forward, and whoever's responsible make the changes. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, there's lots of corruption, no doubt, going on with the government and with corporations like the army and that sort of thing. At high levels, they pretty much seem to do whatever they want. I suppose I can't really give an opinion of how to do that because I'm not in that sort of field. I would like to see something done about it, because bullying from school even to the level of army is horrific, and obviously people lose their lives, commit suicide because of bullying, and whatever level, it's just a bad thing.
I think measures have got to take place where there is some kind of, I suppose it's a method of trust, but it's obviously something quite deep-rooted. It's got to be cut out at certain levels. Like, you've got to have people in positions of responsibility that are actually cutting this out and saying, come on now, this person's going to be in your position in a few years' time. Do you want to keep this? Do you want this to carry on? Rather than just a consistent flow and cycle of this happening, which probably has been happening for quite some time.
A full thorough investigation should be done, and obviously who's accountable should be made to how can I say, be reprimanded and the case looked into. So yeah, but I don't agree with any kind of bullying or sexual harassment at all within the army, not at all.
The public clearly wish to see strong action against those who bully in the army. How much can be done to stop this kind of abuse?
Well, as I say, this is something which is absolutely intrinsic to the way in which armed forces are created. You can't have people who, you know, they're born into a society, they're brought up in a society, and their natural values are not to work under this kind of discipline and to go and occupy other people's countries or to kill other human beings. In order to get an individual into that condition, into that state of mind, to be willing to obey those kind of orders, some form of dehumanisation has to take place. I welcome whatever reforms might be made, and I'm sure there are better and worse training programmes, and there are better and worse cultures within the armed forces, and I'm in favour of better training and of a better culture. But ultimately you won't be able to eradicate that element which is concerned with dehumanising people to the point where they're willing to go and kill.
Fundamentally, what the British Army needs is a trade union. It may sound strange in this day and age, but a voice that the soldiers can have which is outside of the military. Because they can't trust the military police, because the military police have a vested interest in working with the officers and the hierarchy within the armed forces. And they can't trust some other ranks who are aligned with the officers and the hierarchy, such as the senior NCOs. So what they need is a body outside of that, which will represent their views, such as a trade union, which will be able to go in there and fight for their rights and their civil liberties.
Finally, we turn to a question of hypocrisy. The British government preaches to other countries about human rights abuses. But what message does abuse and possibly murder in the British Army itself send abroad?
And the final question really is, the government preaches human rights values and goes to war about human rights values in other countries. Given the demonstrable official record showing there's been bullying in the British Army, what kind of message does that send to our foes abroad?
Well, not a good message, obviously. These sounds like very basic things, which is the very least of what you'd expect in an organisation that's, you know, out there, like most of them are, to protect the nation and to, you know, to try and find peace some way, shape or form.
Well, I mean, one of the things about this is to make sure that you don't take isolated incidents and it becomes people's perception that that's the norm across every part of the army or any part of society. I mean, these are obviously very sad and extreme situations where people have lost their life through suicide or through other means. I wouldn't allow that to cloud my judgment to think that is, you know, systemic in the army at all levels. But I think you're right. You need to make sure you have a clean shop at home before you can preach to others. But I think that's the society we live in. You know, we often take a very advanced position on a policy, and we don't always necessarily get our own house in order.
And finally, Britain goes to war to defend human rights abroad, but we've got bullying in our own army. The fighting force bullies itself. Mm-hmm. What kind of message does that send to our enemies?
Not the best message at all. As I keep saying, it's totally unacceptable. Bullying on any level, from the school playground all the way up to, say, work, is totally unacceptable, and it should be dealt with properly.
Obviously it sends the wrong message here, because we should stand up for our own culture and our own rights no matter where they're being displayed. And you only look to the American bullying in Guantanamo. You may not agree with the terrorist activities, but equally if we act like them, we're no better than them. So that's my view. In any effect, the whole world isn't a big illusion anyway, so why worry?
Oh, absolutely. No, it's very inconsistent. If it's true, if it's been proven to be true, then yes, it is. I mean, what leg can you stand on where you can criticise another country for doing what you are yourself doing as a country? It's hypocrisy at best, isn't it, really? But
do these contradictions harm the British reputation abroad? We invited comment from our experts.
Well, I think it makes people think that there's a deeply hypocritical strand in the kind of narrative that the British elite have about themselves and about other people in the world. It's no advert for the supposed ability of British troops to bring civilization or to help people reconstruct their countries, as it's put in modern terms, if this is what goes on. And of course we know that it doesn't just go on in the British Army. We've seen the treatment of prisoners. We've seen recently the case of a wounded Afghan being shot completely, as the soldier said, who did it outside the terms of the Geneva Convention. And the thing is, war is never pretty, and particularly the kind of wars which are involved in occupying other people's countries in societies which are absolutely no threat to Britain whatsoever. That's never going to be a pretty, moral or acceptable process.
Well, abuse is a relative term. The British Armed Forces has a large contingent of youth who are between the ages of 16 and a half coming up to 18 who are waiting to go into the Armed Forces, which is a clear breach of European law, but the British government still goes along with this. The British Army talks about the lack, or the thing, people shouldn't be abused, but then again it supplies victims for Guantanamo Bay, it does rendition, and as we've heard from the Panorama programme only yesterday, add judicial killings, illegal judicial killings in Northern Ireland. So I think it doesn't have a clean record, and I don't think it should be preaching.
4 young recruits died in suspicious circumstances in Deepcut Army Barracks. This was a tale of inconsistencies and cover-ups over deaths which may indeed have been murder. Those who know the case are appalled the parents of those who died are no closer to the truth almost 2 decades since the first deaths occurred. As Britain wages war abroad, unanswered questions within the military establishment in the UK raise questions about integrity of those running the very fighting forces sent abroad to enforce British values. And the question remains, why is the British establishment so frightened of a public inquiry if it has nothing to fear from the findings? Whatever excuses they offer, until they can respond to this difficult question, the simple answer is that the possible cover-up of murders in the army itself could be the deepest cut of all.